Hello there friends, welcome back to the channel. It's day 11 of Inktober 2024 and time for the 11th illustration out of the 31 for this month. For today's illustration, the prompt was snacks and our lonely protagonist here, Nomad 31, seems to have found a friend. And for this illustration, what I have drawn is a puppy which was hiding behind a brick wall and was playing around in the tall grass and shrubs. Well, Nomad 31 noticed him and he has kept this small bowl of snacks out for him, probably trying to lure him to becoming friends. Let's see what happens next. If you want to follow the storyline of Nomad 31 and the illustrations, I keep posting all of these on Instagram and I write down the story in the captions. So you can follow me on Instagram and you can also share your Inktober illustrations with me and I'll make sure to feature them on my story. So enjoy this illustration process and let's start with the podcast. Grab a cup of coffee, get your favorite snacks. Let's begin. For today's podcast, I am going to talk about a specific rule for arranging compositions. Not only was this applied to photography, but it was also later applied to illustrations and drawing, and even painting. This is the rule of thirds, which basically splits an image into thirds in vertical as well as horizontal manner. How is it done? You can draw 2 lines vertically and 2 lines horizontally. This basically divides any picture into 9 equal segments. Now, the overlapping areas are indicated by red circles, as you will be able to see on your screens in this picture, the one which I'm drawing today. It actually arranges into the rule of thirds, and the fact that the puppy as well as the bowl of snacks falls into red circle zones, which are the focal points, which are the main focal points of an image, as has been studied by the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds can actually be used to draw the viewer's attention to particular elements of a composition. And when applying the rule of thirds, it is generally considered a good practice not to just cram all the details into the central region, but rather keep it towards one side and let the scene speak for itself by keeping the remaining elements of the scene towards the other sides. And filling all the 4 focal points with the elements of your illustration can make the illustration a bit crowded. Here, what is happening is at one focal point, I have the puppy, and at the second focal point, I have the bowl of snacks. The remaining part is actually covered by the foreground element, which is the pavement beneath the wall as well as the wall itself. What this does is it creates an opportunity for me to fit quite a number of elements into the whole scene. Now, the rule of thirds is like this fundamental principle in visual composition at this point. And let me tell you, even though it is called a rule, it is more like a guideline. It is like a best practice. And there are cases when we do break the rule of thirds. Now, dividing the image into these different sections by drawing vertical lines and considering the intersections of these lines as focal points, we can also call them the power points, where the actual elements of the whole illustration are placed to create a more visually interesting and dynamic composition. Why was the rule of thirds used so much, and why did it come into such popular opinion of using the rule of thirds? Well, it is actually based upon the natural eye movement of us human beings. Our eyes are naturally drawn towards the intersections of these lines, towards the intersection regions, because the natural movement of the eyes is in sort of a gliding motion in an S-shaped curve starting from the top left corner of a page coming to the bottom right. And by placing the objects of interest at the focal points, what we do is we attract the viewer's attention towards the most significant parts of the image. And what this does is it prevents the whole illustration, the whole composition, from looking a bit dull or from looking static or cluttered. Now, from a storytelling point of view, placing the main subject a bit off-center can create a striking visual imagery, and it intrigues the viewer into finding the reason why was it done, and also allows for the inclusion of elements that support the story or the theme of the image. So for beginners, applying the rule of thirds is not something which comes around naturally. If I look at many of my illustrations, I have done this previously because I used to practice the rule of thirds. And let me show you an on-screen example right here. In this illustration, I didn't really plan on making it according to the rule of thirds, but it still falls into place. The character's face is actually at one focal point, and the whole spoonful of food which he's going to eat is at another focal point. The remaining 2 focal points are actually areas of lesser focus, which I don't really want the viewer to look at that much, but the 2 major focal points where the viewer's attention is attracted as per this map are filled with what I want to be in focus. So this does create a level of depth, a level of direction in your image. It is guiding the viewer to look at the things which we want them to look at and is important from a storytelling perspective. And obviously, if as a visual storyteller able to smoothly guide your viewers' attention towards the things which actually need importance in the storyline, it's going to be an epic way to tell your stories. Okay, now coming to the fact at making this easier for beginners. Well, what you can do if you're a beginner is start making this grid, and you can arrange your elements, the elements of your illustration, in any manner you want. There is actually no stringent way in which you should do it. You can study quite a number of photographs, you can study a number of illustrations by the pros, you can even look at illustrations which have been done in comic books or graphic novels and use the rule as per your wish. You can bend it. There is no real way to follow the rule actually. If you are utilizing the focal points, if you're utilizing 3 out of the 4 focal points at a time, even at that time the illustration doesn't look busy. And if you decide at using all the 4 focal points in your image, then you should keep in mind that you should also use negative space as a separating factor between these so that your image doesn't look too busy or too cluttered. But as beginners, is it always necessary to follow the rule of thirds? Well, as I said previously in this video, that it may be called a rule, but it is more of a guideline, more of a best practice for artists, illustrators, or even photographers. What about a portrait illustration? Yes, it is possible that for a portrait illustration, you can draw the character a bit offset and show off some of the background. But what if you don't have a background to show? What if you're drawing it on just a plain negative space, on a plain background? What will you do? Well, at these points, keeping the subject at the center of the frame actually is a better option because it gives a sense of balance. It gives a sense of symmetry in the whole picture. And let me tell you, nature loves symmetry and nature tends towards symmetry. So if you're trying to portray something in this manner, it is not going to be bad, obviously, because if nature loves symmetry, how can our eyes not love the vision of a symmetrical image? So when you're making portraits, you do break the rule of thirds quite a lot, especially if your subject is centered on the canvas. Also, there are points when breaking this rule can create a visually interesting or impactful composition. For example, a king is sitting on his throne. This scene, if it is drawn in a very centered fashion, it is obviously going to create a powerful image. Instead of being offset to one side and showing his whole row of ministers sitting on one side of the king, if you show the king on his throne and his whole row of ministers leading up to the king, this creates a more powerful image. It is at these points when the rule of thirds is actually thrown out of the window. Many of the artists, many of the pro artists have always said that for portrait illustrations, the rule of thirds doesn't really apply that well. So as beginners, yes, you can obviously use it as a tool to arrange the different components of your illustration, as I've said many a times, because planning your illustrations is very important, especially you are drawing with pen and ink, because it's going to be permanent. You don't have a chance to erase, undo, or go back if you're drawing with pen and ink. Once you have completed your drafting and once you have done the inks, there's no going back. So before actually proceeding with the inking steps, what you can do is you can arrange the different elements of your illustrations as per the rule of thirds whenever it is applicable, whenever you think that it will be a good time to apply this. And what happens is slowly most of your illustrations will start falling into this pattern where you're making offset characters, where you're making offset elements, and it really helps bring out that harmony, that smoothness of storyline in your composition. Apart from that, whenever you have this creative flair within you, whenever you know you can pull something off, go for it, definitely. Because as beginners, if you want to create striking imagery, experimentation is one of the most important parts of it. Experiment with the various types of arrangements that you can possibly think of. If you're a budding comic artist or a manga artist, or you're making a graphic novel, then definitely the arrangement of your panels, the types of compositions you are going to put into each panel, experiment with everything. You have a lot of scope to develop the story. And if you're making something like me, if you're making a series of single piece compositions, then keep in mind that you will need to plan a bit ahead and keep things in mind as you are drawing all the elements of your illustration. I hope these tips and this overall information about the rule of thirds and how you can use it or sometimes even break it helps you in your art journey. I'll see you in the next video with a new concept tomorrow. Till then, take care, be creative, peace.